Have you ever looked at your garden in the middle of summer and thought that if you just keep watering and feeding those tomatoes or cucumbers a little longer, they will finally wake up and start producing? I used to think exactly the same way until I learned a lesson that cost me almost half of my vegetable patch. Sometimes the biggest mistake is not what you forgot to plant, but what you refuse to stop growing. A struggling plant that has almost no chance of giving you a harvest can quietly steal your time, your water, your fertilizer, and even create problems for the healthy crops growing beside it. Today, I want to talk about 3 vegetables that many people keep trying to save long after they should have made a different decision. The first is tomatoes that have stopped growing and never begin setting fruit. The second is cucumbers that stay weak for weeks without producing healthy vines or flowers. The third is sweet peppers that remain tiny, pale, and lifeless while everything else around them keeps moving forward. I am not talking about plants that simply need a few more warm days. I mean those that have clearly fallen behind because of disease, severe stress, damaged roots, or other serious problems and show no real signs of recovery. Many gardeners keep pouring expensive fertilizer around them, hoping for a miracle. I did the same years ago because I hated giving up on something I had planted with my own hands. But what I discovered surprised me. Weak plants often become magnets for pests and disease because they cannot defend themselves properly. They also keep drawing nutrients and moisture from the soil while giving almost nothing back. Even worse, many people never notice the quiet changes happening around those weak plants until nearby vegetables also begin to lose strength. By the middle of this video, I will show you all 7 vegetables that deserve special attention when they completely fail to establish, and I will explain why leaving them in place without making a careful decision can sometimes create much bigger problems than pulling them out. I will also tell you about 3 gardeners I personally know who ignored these warning signs and watched healthy sections of their gardens slowly decline before they understood what was really happening. 1. Thing I wish someone had told me years ago is that the garden does not reward stubbornness. It rewards paying attention. Most people believe that if a plant is struggling, the answer is always more fertilizer, more water, or another expensive product from the garden center. That sounds reasonable until you see the opposite happen. A tomato that has already lost most of its healthy leaves keeps receiving food every week, but instead of growing it, simply becomes a place where insects gather first. The cucumber beside it keeps stretching but never forms healthy fruit, and every few days another yellow leaf appears. Then the pepper that looked weak from the beginning stays the same size while the neighboring vegetables slowly lose their rich green color. That is usually the moment when I stop trying to rescue the plant and start protecting the rest of the garden instead. Many years ago, an older gardener showed me something I never forgot. He said, "Never let one hopeless plant become the landlord of your garden, because everything around it ends up paying the rent." At first I laughed because it sounded strange, but after enough seasons I understood exactly what he meant. Weak plants often continue using moisture nutrients and your attention while giving almost nothing in return. They may also provide shelter for pests or become the first place where fungal problems begin after warm, humid weather. That does not mean every slow plant must be removed. Some recover very well. But when weeks pass with no healthy growth, no flowers, no new strong leaves, and obvious signs that the plant has stopped developing, you have to ask yourself an honest question. Am I growing vegetables, or am I growing false hope? Before making that decision, I always inspect the roots, the stem, and the newest leaves, because they usually tell the real story. In a few minutes, I will introduce 2 more vegetables that many gardeners keep feeding, even after they have almost no realistic chance of producing a worthwhile harvest. After that, there are 2 final crops that surprise nearly everyone because most people never imagine they can quietly affect the rest of the bed when they completely fail. And then I will share the first story of a gardener whose determination ended up costing him far more than a single tomato plant dot. The next 2 vegetables on my list surprise many people because almost nobody thinks of them this way. The fourth is zucchini, and the fifth is eggplant. Both can be wonderful crops when they establish strong roots early and continue producing through the season. But when they spend week after week standing almost still with yellowing leaves, weak stems, and no healthy flowers, they often become a burden instead of a harvest. I have seen people continue feeding them every few days, hoping that one more application of fertilizer would suddenly change everything. Most of the time, it never does. A plant that has suffered serious root damage from waterlogged soil or has been weakened by disease rarely catches up with the healthy plants around it during the same season. Instead, it keeps taking moisture from the bed and creates dense, shaded places where pests and fungal problems can become more comfortable. That is why I always tell people to stop looking only at the calendar and start looking at the condition of the plant itself. A healthy vegetable almost always shows you that it wants to live. New leaves appear, the stem thickens. Flowers begin forming. Even slow growth is still growth. But when nothing changes for a long time despite good weather, proper watering, and healthy soil, I stop trying to force nature to do something it has already decided against. This reminds me of a man named Robert who had one of the nicest gardens in our area. One summer, he planted tomatoes, cucumbers, and 2 rows of zucchini. Early in the season, everything looked promising except for one zucchini plant that never really developed. Its leaves stayed small and pale while the others became large and dark green. Robert kept saying that it would recover because he had already spent money on compost fertilizer and mulch. Every week, he added more feed around that one struggling plant. By July, it still had almost nothing to show for all that effort. What he did not notice was that aphids had gathered there first because the weak leaves were easier to attack. Before long, they spread to nearby healthy plants. Then, powdery mildew appeared on the old damaged leaves after several humid days. Soon, he found himself spraying, treating, removing leaves, and spending hours trying to save vegetables that had been perfectly healthy just a short time before. At the end of the season, he admitted something that stayed with me. He said the biggest mistake was not planting the weak zucchini. The biggest mistake was refusing to accept that it had already failed. From that day forward, I learned that protecting healthy plants is often more valuable than endlessly trying to rescue one that clearly has little chance of rewarding all the extra effort. And there are still 2 more vegetables left on my list that many gardeners overlook completely, even though they can create the same kind of disappointment when they never establish properly. And one of the next stories is even harder to believe because it began with what looked like the healthiest corner of an entire garden. Now, it is time to reveal the last 2 vegetables because these are the ones that people almost never suspect. The 6th is bush beans, and the 7th is cabbage. Both of these crops can give the wonderful harvests when they start strong and continue developing normally. But when they become badly stunted early in the season and simply stop growing, they deserve the same honest evaluation as every other vegetable we have talked about today. A cabbage that stays the size of your hand for weeks without forming a proper head is telling you something. Bush beans that remain short with pale leaves and almost no flowers after favorable weather are also sending a message. Many gardeners keep watering, feeding, and waiting because they think giving up would mean admitting failure. I understand that feeling because I have stood in the same place looking at plants that I wanted to save. But there comes a moment when the smartest gardener is not the one who works the hardest. It is the one who knows where to stop investing time and start protecting the rest of the garden. This became very clear to me after visiting a woman named Helen, who had always been proud of her vegetable patch. Everything looked beautiful from a distance. The tomato vines were tall, the onions were healthy, and the carrots looked perfect. But one row of cabbage never developed properly. Every head remained small with damaged outer leaves that she kept hoping would recover. She continued adding fertilizer every couple of weeks because she believed the plants were simply hungry. They were not. The damaged leaves became a comfortable hiding place for cabbage worms and other pests that multiplied quietly while everyone admired the healthy vegetables nearby. By the time she realized what was happening, Those insects had already moved into neighboring brassicas, and she spent the rest of the summer removing damaged leaves instead of harvesting vegetables. She told me afterward that if she had removed those hopeless plants much earlier, she would have saved herself many hours of unnecessary work. Then there was another gardener named Michael. His problem began with a row of weak bush beans that never established strong roots after several weeks of cold, wet weather. Instead of replacing them or using the space for another quick crop, he continued feeding them all summer. The beans never produced enough pods to fill a single basket. Meanwhile, weeds grew thicker around the weak plants because there was little healthy foliage to shade the soil. The extra watering encouraged even more weed growth and forced him to spend every weekend pulling weeds instead of enjoying his garden. Looking back, he admitted that the harvest from that entire section barely justified the cost of the fertilizer he had used. That is why I always remind myself that a vegetable garden is not only about keeping every single plant alive, it is about helping the strongest plants reach their full potential. In the next part, I want to explain something that many people misunderstand. They believe these failed vegetables somehow poison the soil forever. That is not what usually happens. The real danger is much more ordinary and much easier to prevent if you understand what is actually taking place beneath the surface and around those struggling plants. This is the part where I think many gardeners become worried, because they hear people say that if a failed crop stays in one place, the soil will be ruined for years. From everything I have seen over the decades, that is usually not what happens. Healthy soil is surprisingly resilient when it is cared for properly. The real danger is much simpler, and that is exactly why so many people overlook it. When a plant has stopped growing because of disease, severe stress-damaged roots, or a heavy pest attack, it often becomes a permanent source of trouble instead of a productive member of the garden. Every extra week that plant remains in the ground gives insects another place to hide and reproduce. Old diseased leaves can continue releasing fungal spores after rain or heavy morning dew. Weeds quickly take advantage of the empty space beneath weak plants because there is very little healthy foliage left to shade the soil. Then the gardener keeps watering and fertilizing that same area, hoping to save a crop that has already shown almost no sign of recovery. Meanwhile, the healthy vegetables nearby receive less attention because all the effort is focused on the weakest plants. That is the cycle I have watched many times. The problem is not that one struggling tomato or cucumber somehow poisons the earth forever. The problem is that it changes how you spend your time and where the pests and diseases find their easiest target. Once those populations increase, they naturally begin exploring nearby healthy plants as well. I learned another old habit from a gardener who had been growing vegetables for more than 50 years. Every Saturday morning, he slowly walked through every row without carrying a watering can or fertilizer. He carried only a small knife and a bucket. He said the first job was not feeding the garden. The first job was making decisions. If he found a plant that was clearly beyond recovery because of serious disease or complete failure to develop, he removed it immediately together with as much of the damaged root system as possible. He never threw obviously diseased material into ordinary compost because some plant diseases can survive there. Instead, he disposed of it separately and then lightly loosened the soil. If the season allowed, he planted a quick replacement crop or covered the area with mulch so weeds would not take over. That simple routine saved him countless hours later in the summer. It also reminded him that every empty space in the garden could still serve a purpose even after one vegetable had failed. Sometimes a short planting of lettuce beans or herbs was enough to keep the soil active until the season ended. Other times, he simply let the bed rest under organic mulch before adding compost for the following year. Healthy soil is built through consistent care, not through forcing one hopeless plant to survive at any cost. In the next part, I will show you exactly what I do after removing a failed vegetable so the surrounding crops continue growing strongly, and the same area has the best possible chance of producing an even better harvest next season without wasting money on unnecessary products. So, what do I actually do when I decide that one of these vegetables is not going to recover? The answer is much simpler than most people expect, and it certainly does not involve expensive treatments or filling the soil with chemicals. First, I remove the plant carefully instead of pulling it out as hard as I can. I try to lift as much of the root system as possible because badly damaged roots can continue breaking down near the surface and sometimes attract unwanted insects. If I suspect the plant was struggling because of a serious disease rather than weather or poor establishment, I do not leave the leaves lying in the garden, and I do not add them to my regular compost pile. I dispose of them separately, so I am not giving any disease a chance to survive until next season. Then I look closely at the soil instead of immediately reaching for fertilizer. If the ground is compacted, I loosen only the top few inches without turning the entire bed upside down. That keeps the soil structure in much better condition and disturbs fewer beneficial organisms that have been working there all season. After that, I spread a light layer of mature compost if I have some available, and cover the area with organic mulch if I am not planting anything else right away. This keeps the surface cooler, helps hold moisture, and slows down weeds that are always waiting for an empty place to appear. If there is still enough time left in the season, I often replace the failed crop with something quick and reliable. Depending on the weather, that might be lettuce, spinach, radishes, or a few herbs that can still give me something useful before autumn arrives. If the season is already too far along, I simply leave the bed protected and prepare it properly for next year instead of chasing a harvest that is unlikely to happen. That approach has saved me far more money than buying another bag of fertilizer for a plant that had already stopped growing weeks earlier. The biggest lesson I learned was that every dollar and every hour should be invested where there is still real potential. Healthy plants reward your attention. Hopeless plants usually only ask for more of it. I also make a habit of watching the vegetables that were growing closest to the one I removed. For the next week or two, I inspect their leaves every morning while the light is soft. If I notice insects beginning to appear or damaged leaves, I deal with the problem early before it spreads any farther. Most of the time, those neighboring plants continue growing normally because the main source of stress has already been removed. Looking back over many seasons, I can honestly say that some of my best harvests came after I accepted a small loss early, instead of allowing it to become a much larger one later. There is one final lesson that completely changed the way I think about gardening, and it has nothing to do with giving up. It has everything to do with knowing the difference between patience and persistence on one side and wasting precious time on the other. That is the thought I want to leave you with before we finish, Dot. After all these years in the garden, there is one lesson I trust more than any fertilizer bag or gardening advertisement. A successful season is not measured by how many plants you manage to keep alive until autumn. It is measured by how wisely you spend your time, your energy, and your attention. I know it can feel painful to remove a tomato that never produced a single fruit or a cucumber that stayed weak from the day it was planted. We become attached to the things we grow because we remember the day we put them into the soil and imagine the harvest that would come later. But a garden teaches us something that few other hobbies can teach. Nature is always moving forward, and sometimes the smartest decision is to move forward with it instead of fighting against it. Whenever I remove a vegetable that has clearly failed because of disease-severe damage or complete lack of development, I never think of it as giving up. I think of it as making room for everything else that still has a chance to succeed. That simple change in thinking completely transformed the way I garden. Instead of spending weeks trying to rescue one hopeless plant, I spend those same weeks helping the healthy vegetables produce the biggest harvest they possibly can. The tomatoes that are full of flowers receive my attention. The cucumbers covered with young fruit receive clean water and careful support. The peppers that continue forming new leaves receive the nutrients they can actually use. Every healthy plant benefits because I stopped wasting precious resources where they were no longer making a difference. At the end of the season, I also take a few quiet minutes to remember which vegetables struggled and ask myself why. Was the soil too wet? Did I plant too early? Did that corner receive enough sunlight? Was there a disease that should be prevented next year by rotating crops instead of planting the same family in exactly the same place? Those simple questions have improved my harvest far more than buying another expensive product. Every season becomes a lesson instead of a disappointment. And if there is one thing I hope you remember from today's conversation, it is this. Do not judge your garden by the number of plants still standing. Judge it by the health of the plants that are still growing. Remove seriously failed vegetables when they clearly have little chance of recovering. Protect the healthy ones before problems spread. Care for your soil with compost mulch and sensible crop rotation instead of expecting miracles from fertilizer alone. That is how gardeners quietly improve year after year without spending unnecessary money or exhausting themselves. I hope this story helps you look at your own garden a little differently the next time you walk between the rows. Sometimes the biggest harvest begins with one honest decision. And if you have ever faced this choice yourself, I would love to hear what happened in your own garden, because every season teaches us something worth sharing with the next gardener who is still learning, just as I once was.